So what if the biggest thing holding us back from prosperity isn't some outside force, but, well, us? Today, we're digging into a source article with a really provocative title, We're Keeping Ourselves Poor. The author's whole argument is that our economic struggles aren't just something that happens to us. Instead, they're a direct result of the things we demand from our leaders and, who we vote for. It's a pretty challenging idea for sure, so let's break down exactly how the author makes their case.
And this image from the article, it really sums up the entire argument in one picture, doesn't it? On one side, you've got this path leading to poverty, all weighed down by what the author calls handouts and government dependency. And on the other side, a path to wealth, built on things like enterprise, competition, and personal responsibility. The whole debate, as the source frames it, is this fundamental choice between two very different futures.
Which brings us right to the central question the author wants us to ask ourselves. This isn't about blaming history or other countries. No, the article is asking directly, are we, through our own actions and our own votes, actually playing a role in our own economic problems? According to the author, the answer is a big, uncomfortable yes.
So how exactly does this trap work? Well, the article's first big idea is something it calls the cycle of dependency. The argument is that citizens and politicians are kind of locked in this loop, a cycle that keeps feeding itself and just reinforces the very problems it's supposed to be solving.
This quote from the source really hits hard on the role of the voter. The idea here isn't that some broken system was forced on people. The argument is that we actually build it with our votes. Every time we ask for a handout, the author says, we're forging another chain. The prison isn't built for us, we're building it ourselves.
Okay, so the author breaks this cycle down into 4 pretty clear steps. Step 1, citizens demand government solutions and handouts. Step 2, politicians, obviously wanting to get elected, promise to deliver exactly that. Step 3, this creates more and more bureaucracy, more rules, more regulations. And finally, step 4, all that bureaucracy makes people more dependent on the system, which, you guessed it, makes them demand even more government solutions. It's a perfect, vicious circle.
To try and prove this theory, the article then moves from ideas to real-world examples. It lays out this really stark economic comparison between the Philippines and its neighbors, arguing that different choices have led to completely different results. And the numbers? Well, they're pretty eye-opening. I mean, just look at the difference in GDP per capita. That's basically the average economic output for each person. It is absolutely staggering. But here's the kicker. The really crucial piece of info the article points out. Back in the 1960s, Singapore was actually poorer. The author argues this huge gap we see today is no accident. It's the direct result of decades of different choices.
So what were those choices? The article boils it down to something pretty simple. Singapore, it says, chose the path of economic freedom, of open competition. The Philippines, on the other hand, chose a path of government protectionism and subsidies. The results, according to the author, prosperity versus stagnation. It's all right there.
And hey, it's not just Singapore. The article also uses Vietnam as an example. In 1986, Vietnam started these big economic reforms they called Doi Moi. At the time, their poverty rate was over 50%. By 2020, it had dropped to under 5%. The author puts this right next to the Philippines' much slower progress, arguing it's yet another case of different choices, different outcomes.
All right, now we're getting into the part of the article that's probably the most controversial. The author argues that some of the Philippines' greatest cultural strengths are actually being twisted in ways that hold the country back. Let's see how they make this argument.
First up is bayanihan. You know, that incredible spirit of community, of neighbors helping each other out, whether it's literally carrying a house to a new spot or just coming together after a typhoon. It's a powerful, grassroots, kind of social safety net.
And this is the author's big but. They claim this strength gets perverted when people start demanding that the government create official programs to do what Bayanhina always did naturally. The argument is that this replaces real, efficient community spirit with slow, clunky bureaucracy, and that actually weakens the whole idea of self-reliance. Okay, next, the article looks at diskarte. This is another celebrated trait, right? That amazing Filipino talent for being resourceful, for finding a clever way to solve a problem, for making things work no matter what. It's like a built-in entrepreneurial spirit.
But here's the problem, according to the author. The incentives in the system are all wrong. The article claims that because the system rewards finding loopholes or knowing the right people more than it rewards actually innovating and serving customers, all that amazing diskarte gets funneled into gaming the system instead of building real businesses.
So,
All of this leads to a pretty big question, doesn't it? If the problems are so obvious, why is real, fundamental change so hard to come by? Well, the article suggests a psychological reason, a deep-down fear of responsibility.
The article uses the debate over federalism as a perfect example. On paper, the promise is great. You move power closer to the people. Local leaders become directly accountable to you. But the author says the fear is that accountability. If power is truly local, you can't just blame some distant politician in Manila anymore when your roads have potholes or the local school is falling apart. That responsibility lands right on your local officials and on you for electing them. And that, the author claims, is a burden many just don't want. And the author applies this exact same logic to economic protectionism. They claim that all these rules that limit foreign companies, rules that are supposed to be protecting Filipino interests, are really just protecting a few powerful local families from competition. And without that competition, the article argues, everyone else ends up with higher prices and worse service.
And so, after laying out the problems, the historical comparisons, and the psychological hurdles, the article brings it all home. It ends with a really direct and powerful call to action that puts all the power for change right in the hands of the individual voter.
But before that final challenge, the author makes a really important point. This whole argument isn't about blaming people for the past. It's about claiming agency for the future. The idea is that history is what it is, but it doesn't get us off the hook for the choices we have to make right here, right now. And so, the author leaves the reader with a series of really sharp questions. First up, are you going to vote for the politician who promises more government programs or the one who promises more freedom? Next, will you vote for protection or will you vote for competition? And finally, are you going to vote for handouts or for opportunities?
And that all leads to the article's final unforgettable line. Choose wisely, or choose poorly, and stop pretending you're a victim of your own choices. Wow, a pretty stark conclusion, right? It leaves absolutely no wiggle room and basically demands that we own the consequences of our decisions, whatever they end up being.
I have to be honest with you, when I first picked up the source material for today's deep dive, I actually hesitated.
Oh.
I read the title, and my immediate reaction was to just flinch. It felt aggressive.
It's certainly not the kind of title you see on a diplomatic policy paper, is it?
Not even close. We're looking at an op-ed by Milton Salo Rothbard called We're Keeping Ourselves Poor, and the subtitle is Why Our Addiction to Government Handouts is a Choice We Keep Making.
Right.
And look, usually when we tackle poverty, especially in the context of a nation like the Philippines, we have a script in our heads. We expect to talk about colonization, unfair trade deals, historical injustices.
The standard narrative,
Yeah.
that poverty is an affliction. It's something that happens to a country, caused by villains outside the room, foreign powers, global markets, maybe just bad luck.
Exactly. But Rothbard, he is flipping the table over. He's arguing the villain is inside the room. Actually, he's going further. He's arguing the villain is us, or, well, the voter.
It's a very confrontational premise. And the mission of this deep dive is to really unpack his argument that the Philippines is suffering from a self-inflicted culture of dependency.
And before we even get into the data, and there is a lot of data, we have to talk about the visual he leads with. It just sets the tone for the entire piece.
It really does.
Yeah, the imagery is so striking. It's like a vintage political poster split right down the middle. On one side, you have this silhouette of a person just wrapped in chains. But the chains aren't labeled colonialism or oppression. They have these little tags like handouts, regulations, and subsidies.
And this figure is pointing a finger, right?
An angry, blaming finger at a government building way off in the distance.
And the other side.
It's a complete contrast. It's a figure standing tall, holding a toolkit and a briefcase. And the labels there are enterprise, competition, responsibility. I mean, it is as subtle as a sledgehammer.
It perfectly summarizes his core thesis, that national poverty isn't just a matter of fate or history, it's an active, repeated choice made at the ballot box.
But this is where I get stuck, and I think a lot of you listening might too. It feels like incredibly tough love, or maybe just victim blaming. Is it fair to blame people who are struggling for the system they live in?
That's the central tension, isn't it?
I mean, if you're poor, you need help. You're not choosing poverty.
And he's not saying people want to be poor. Of course not. No one wants that. He's saying that the specific methods voters choose to try and escape poverty are the very things creating the cage.
So the solutions are the problem.
Exactly. He calls the citizenry the architects of their own prison.
Architects of their own prison. Wow. That is a heavy accusation.
It is. He writes, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Every time we vote for the candidate promising the most handouts, we lay another brick in the wall."
Okay, let's unpack that. Because if I'm a voter and I'm struggling to put food on the table and a candidate says, "I will give you rice," I'm going to vote for that guy. Rothbard is saying that impulse is wrong.
He describes it as a reflex, a kind of conditioned instinct to look upward, specifically to Manila, to the central government for salvation. And he argues this creates a dangerous feedback loop.
A feedback loop of demand.
Yes, think about wages. When wages are low, what's the first thing people demand?
A higher minimum wage. Legislated wage hike, they call it.
Right. Seems logical, but Rothbard points out the flaw. The voter asks for a mandate, a legislative fix, rather than demanding an economic environment where businesses actually have to compete for workers.
So instead of making our labor more valuable through, say, productivity,
We just make it more expensive by law.
and that can backfire.
That often does. If you make labor expensive without the productivity to back it up, businesses hire fewer people, or they shut down. And the poverty trap just deepens. It's the same logic with prices.
When rice gets expensive, the demand isn't for more competition among suppliers.
No, the demand is government, control the prices, give us a subsidy.
And we see this all the time, price caps. And then suddenly there's a shortage because suppliers can't make a profit.
Precisely. It's basic economics. But he argues the political culture just ignores it. And what about when services fail? The trains break down, the internet is slow. What's the outcry?
The government needs to fix this. Or create a new agency to oversee this.
The reflex is never to open the market to better providers who might actually care about the customer. It's always to demand a new bureau.
So we treat the government like a vending machine. We put in a vote, we expect a solution to pop out, and if it doesn't, we just bang on the glass harder.
That's a great analogy.
Oh.
And politicians are just suppliers. Rothbard makes this really sharp point. He says politicians are rational. If voters demanded deregulation and open markets, politicians would offer that to get elected.
But they don't.
No. The market, the voters, demands protection and handouts, so it's exactly what the politicians supply. The bad governance is a service being provided to meet a very specific demand.
That puts a really disturbing spin on political history.
Yeah.
Because we always talk about the Marcos era or colonial history. We say, the system is rigged because of the past.
And he acknowledges that. He's not a history denier.
Right.
He grants that the American colonial period built this very centralized state and that Ferdinand Marcos Sr. absolutely weaponized it.
Right.
But here's the twist in his argument.
Okay.
He says history built the gun, but the voters have been the ones pulling the trigger for the last 40 years.
He's talking about the post-1986 era, after the People Power Revolution.
Yes, the country had a massive reset button. The dictator was gone. But he argues that instead of dismantling that centralized power structure, voters kept choosing it again and again.
And his big data point for that is the 2022 election, the 31 million votes for Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
Exactly.
Okay, but a lot of people would argue that was because of misinformation, social media algorithms, nostalgia for a golden age that never was.
Rothbard sees it differently. He argues it wasn't a trick, it was a conscious purchase. He believes voters looked at 40 years of evidence of that specific style of government centralized, patronage-based, and they essentially said, yes, I'll have that again, please.
Because it's familiar,
Yeah.
because it's what they know.
It's the devil they know. And more importantly, it aligns with that reflex we talked about. It promises that a strong figure in the center will take care of everything. And that is so much more comforting than the uncertainty of a system where you have to compete and rely on yourself.
That is a pretty bleak assessment of voter psychology. It's basically saying we're afraid of freedom because freedom is hard work.
In a way, yes.
But is there proof that the other way, the self-reliant way, actually works better? Or is this just, libertarian theory?
This is where he moves from the sociology to the hard economics. He calls this section the tale of two trajectories, and he uses the comparison game to debunk the idea that the Philippines is poor because of geography or lack of resources.
He starts with the classic ones, Singapore and Hong Kong, and I always hear people dismiss this. Oh, they're tiny city-states you can't compare.
People do, but Rothbard says look at the starting line. In the 1960s, these places were largely poorer than the Philippines. Singapore has zero natural resources. They have to import sand.
And today,
Singapore's GDP per capita is over $70,000. Hong Kong is over 50. The Philippines is struggling to break 4,000.
That gap it's just astronomical. It's not even in the same ballpark.
And he says the size isn't the point. The mechanism is the point. They chose economic freedom. They made it easy to do business. The Philippines chose protectionism. But he has a better comparison.
Vietnam.
Vietnam. And this is the one that really hurts.
Yeah, because they're neighbors, similar populations, similar agricultural base.
And the timeline is identical. It's brutal. Both countries had a pivotal reset in 1986. The Philippines had the EDSA revolution. Vietnam launched their Oimo reforms.
And let's remember, in 1986, Vietnam was coming out of a devastating war. I mean, they were bombed flat. They were way, way behind the Philippines.
Significantly poorer. Famine was a real threat. But look at the trajectory. Rothbard cites that Vietnam's poverty rate dropped from around 50% to under 5% today.
Oh, and the Philippines?
Still stuck, hovering around the 20% mark for decades.
So what did Vietnam do differently? They're a communist country, for crying out loud. You'd think they would be the ones addicted to government control.
That's the irony. Rothbard argues that while on paper they're communist, in practice, they aggressively embraced markets. They courted foreign investment. They liberalized agriculture. They just got out of the way.
And what did the Philippines choose?
Rothbard says the Philippines, a democracy, chose mandates.
Mandates. What does he mean by that?
Constitutional restrictions on ownership, protecting local industries so they don't have to compete, maintaining a web of regulations that makes it almost impossible to start a small business. It's the difference between equality of opportunity, a level playing field, and equality of outcome.
Trying to legislate success.
Right. And his frustration is that voters keep choosing the mandates, the system that produces the 20% poverty rate, because it promises protection, even if that protection is actually stagnation.
Which leads him to what is, I think, the most sensitive part of his whole op-ed, where he claims this political addiction has actually warped the culture itself. He says, Filipino cultural strengths have been perverted by bad politics.
This part really makes you pause, doesn't it? He talks about Bayanihan.
Yes. Now, for anyone listening who doesn't know, Bayanihan is this idea of communal unity. It's a beautiful thing. The classic image is neighbors literally lifting a house on their shoulders to move it.
It's voluntary mutual aid.
So how can you pervert that?
By bureaucratizing it. Bayanihan is supposed to be horizontal people helping people. Rothbard argues voters have turned it into a vertical demand. Instead of neighbors helping neighbors, the voter demands the government do all the lifting.
So it becomes, I don't need to help my neighbor, the Department of Social Welfare should do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you transfer that responsibility to the state, the community muscle just atrophies. You stop looking at each other, you all just stare up at Manila.
Then there's discard. I love this word. It means hustle, ingenuity, finding a way to make things work. It's what we admire in overseas Filipino workers.
It's a superpower, a survival trait. But Rothbard asks, look what happens to discard inside the Philippines. Because the bureaucracy is so complex, discard gets channeled into gaming the system.
Oh, I see. So instead of using your creativity to invent a new product,
you use your creativity to figure out who to bribe to get a permit, or how to get a connection to a politician. The talent is there, but the incentives are all broken.
That's tragic, taking a cultural asset and turning it into a liability because the environment is toxic.
And finally, he touches on family responsibility, the bedrock of society. He argues that by voting for politicians who promise to replace family duty with state programs, voters are actually hurting their own families.
How so?
Because paying for those programs requires higher taxes or, inflation. If the government just prints money for handouts, your savings get eaten away, so the family becomes weaker and needs more help from the state. It's a vicious cycle.
That leads right into the bureaucratic labyrinth. He cites some heavy hitters here. He mentions the late economist Cayetano Pataranga,
who warned about this years ago. Pataranga said the country was creating a culture of dependency rather than a culture of productivity. And Rothbard points to the 4Ps program, the cash transfer program, as the prime example.
Okay, wait. I have to push back here. The 4Ps helps millions of the poorest households. It keeps kids in school. Is Rothbard really saying we should just scrap the safety net? That seems incredibly cruel.
He's not arguing against a safety net. He's arguing against a permanent hammock. He points out that for many, the 4Ps has shifted from being a temporary bridge to a permanent lifestyle. And because it covers 4 million households,
that's a massive voting bloc.
It's become politically immortal. No politician can suggest reforming it or scaling it back without committing career suicide.
If you touch the 4 Ps, you lose the election. Simple as that.
Exactly. So the dependency deepens, and meanwhile, everyone ignores the regulatory environment that kills jobs in the first place. He cites Ronald Mendoza's research on just how complex the rules are.
The permit rush, basically. I've heard stories of it taking months just to register a small business.
It's a labyrinth. And Rothbard's question is, who demanded this? We did. Every time a business fails, the outcry is, there should be a law. So they pass a law, and another, until only the big guys with armies of lawyers can navigate the system.
Which protects the monopolies.
And that connects to the fear of opening up. Rothbard talks about the constitutional restrictions on foreign ownership. We're told these rules exist to protect Filipino interests.
Filipino first, right? That's the slogan.
But Rothbard asks, whose interests? Look at telecommunications. You have a duopoly. The service is slower and more expensive than in neighboring countries. Why?
Because foreign companies can't easily come in and compete.
Precisely. So are we protecting the Filipino consumer paying high rates for slow data? No. We're protecting the shareholders of the duopoly.
It's a cruel irony. By trying to keep outsiders out, we've locked ourselves in a room with a monopolist, and we keep voting for the politicians who hold the key.
And he contrasts this with India and China. Both had massive poverty. But when they opened up, they didn't just dip a toe in, they embraced competition. And that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. He's basically asking, are we afraid to compete? Do we think we're not good enough?
That really gets to the psychology of it. Why do we keep choosing this? If the data from Vietnam is so clear, why don't we change?
He suggests it's a deep-seated fear of responsibility. And this is where he brings in the argument for federalism or decentralization.
Which is usually framed as a political power struggle.
But Rothbard frames it as a psychological struggle. He thinks voters subconsciously reject it because if power is truly local, you can't blame Manila anymore.
Oh, that's interesting. So if the power is in the capital and my province has no roads, I can say, well, the capital forgot us. It's their fault.
It's a convenient scapegoat. But if you have real autonomy, if your local taxes stay local and your officials have real power and things still fail, then you have to look in the mirror. You voted for that mayor?
It removes the victim card. It forces you to own your community's failures.
Exactly. He cites James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, which argues central planning almost always fails because the center just can't know the local reality. And he mentions Eleanor Ostrom.
The Nobel Prize winner.
Yes. She proved that local communities are much better at managing their own resources than central governments are, only if they have the autonomy to do so. The science is there. But he says we ignore it because the comfort of victimhood is safer than the burden of agency.
Taking responsibility is terrifying. It's much easier to believe a savior is coming.
Which brings us to his ultimatum. Right at the end of the piece, he leaves the reader, and us, with a choice.
He frames the next election not as a contest of personalities, but as a fork in the road. Comfort or change. Handouts or opportunities.
It's that binary in his view. You either vote for the person promising to give you fish, or the person promising to get out of your way so you can go fish for yourself.
And he pivots to the next generation. That was the emotional hook for me. He writes, "Our children are watching what we choose, not what we say."
That cuts deep. If we keep choosing dependency, we're not just choosing a policy. We are teaching the next generation that dependency is the natural state of things.
It reminds me of his final lingering question. It's something I think everyone listening needs to sit with, regardless of your politics, he asks. Are people actually afraid to find out what they are capable of without government help?
That is the provocative thought to end on. It suggests that maybe the poverty isn't just about money. It's about a lack of confidence, a lack of belief that we can actually build something without a permit or a subsidy or a patron.
It forces you to ask where that line is between necessary support, because we obviously need to help the vulnerable and crippling dependency.
Exactly. At what point does help become handcuffs?
A question worth pondering, I think, as we head into any election season anywhere in the world.
Indeed.
That's it for this Dep Dive. A tough topic, a really controversial take, but one that definitely forces you to think differently about poverty and power. Thanks for listening.
Until next time.